All right, let's get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Jinhua Zhao, Professor of Cities and Transportation at MIT. Welcome to the MIT Mobility Forum, hosted by the MIT Mobility Initiative. Today, I'm really excited that John Moenzadi invited Nat Beuse, the Chief Safety Officer from Aurora, to continue the discussion on traffic safety. Right? John will host Nat today for having a presentation and a fireside chat. Before that, I just want to give a little bit context on what we have been discussing of safety throughout the forum. So this term, we had Professor Fred Manning joining us, talk about the perspective on highway safety, contemporary issues, and the forthcoming age of autonomous vehicle. We then had Sam Madden talk about changing driver behavior to improve road safety from MIT and also Cambridge Telematics. Then today, we have Nat Beuse talk about autonomous vehicle, how safety paves the road to success. Before that, in the prior years, we also had Philip Cookman talk about how safety is safe enough for autonomous vehicle, and also Harry Balakrishnan talk about making road safe by making drivers better. So those are a few prior sessions. I'm really glad that Nat joined us to continue the conversation from Aurora's perspective. Now let me pass the forum to John.
Thanks so much, Jinhua. So we have a great forum today. It's really my pleasure to have Nat Beuse, the Chief Safety Officer of Aurora, join us. And honestly, there's no more important topic in mobility to talk about than safety. It really is one of the grand challenges of our time. I mean, as we have spoke about many times on this forum, according to the World Health Organization, approximately 1.2 million people are killed on the roads around the world each year. Fortunately, that number has been slightly declining, but we still obviously have a very long way to go to achieve the safety world that we aspire to and that I think we're actually capable of getting to. We've made the point several times that it's remarkable to contrast the safety situation in our skies with the safety situation on our roads. And so much of that comes down to our own exception, our own acceptance of what's okay and what's not okay. And so clearly we have certainly a much higher threshold, if you will, for safety on our roads as in terms of what's okay than as opposed to the skies. So just to sort of get us going, we'd like to just start with a poll so Nat has a sense of some of the folks on the call. I mean, just as we always do, if you could please type into the chat your location and your time so that Nat has a sense of where we're all coming in, calling in from. So I will also monitor the chat, and we're administering the poll at the same time. And the poll is basically about what's your sort of, to what degree are you involved in autonomous mobility systems in your day-to-day job? So, you know, sort of directly involved in terms of the engineering and the technology design, or sort of indirectly involved, or just curious about the impact of autonomous. So we'll give the poll a little bit more. And Nat, if you have a look at the chat as well, it gives you a sense of where folks are zooming in from. So we have quite a diverse crowd coming from around the world. I'll give the poll just, let's see, we're almost at 80%. Okay, so why don't we close the poll out now and share those results? So it looks like about 12% of the folks have a direct role in the technology deployment of autonomous mobility systems. About half of you are sort of indirectly, and about 40% just curious. So that's great. And then we have a second question that we wanted to ask. So Bhuvan, if you could put that one up. So this is over the next 20 years, if deployed at scale, autonomous mobility technology will directly and significantly decrease road fatalities and injuries, moderately decrease, neither increase nor decrease, moderately increase, or directly and significantly increase. So let's let that settle in a little bit. So we're at about 60% response. About 70%. Okay, why don't we close that out now? So about a quarter of you feel like this technology enables us to directly and significantly decrease road fatalities and injuries, 45% moderately, 10% neither, and about 5% have said this technology could actually make the situation worse on our roads. So that's a bit of context. So now, if I could introduce Nat directly. So Nat is, as Jinhua mentioned, the Chief Safety Officer of Aurora. Aurora is a full-stack autonomous mobility company based in the Bay Area, founded in 2016 by Chris Urmson, who's one of the sort of well-known individuals, thought leaders in the autonomous mobility space. And Nat brings to us the perfect background, I think, to have a really level and informed discussion around autonomous mobility safety. So Nat spent over 2 decades of his career as an executive at the U.S. Department of Transportation's National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which is the lead road safety regulator here in the United States. But then he moved over into sort of the other side, into the business world, moving to Uber to head their safety work around their advanced technology group, is what it was called at the time. And then Uber ATG, the group at Uber working on autonomous vehicles, was subsequently acquired by Aurora. And I think that was in what, 2020, Nat, about that time?
Yep.
Okay, so you've been in this kind of the business domain for, a good 4 or 5 years under your belt, and then in the government domain before that. So Nat, we are absolutely delighted to have you, and we would love to just get a little bit of your perspective on autonomous safety systems, and in particular, Aurora's focus on heavy trucks, and learn more about that and how you guys are thinking about safety of these vehicles on our roads.
Yeah, well, thanks, Jinhua, and thanks, John, for the very kind invite. And it's actually quite timely to come talk about what's happening at Aurora and what's kind of happening in safety. So I thought what I would do today is kind of do the kind of make sure everyone's just dealing from the same set of facts around kind of just what Aurora is doing and all that kind of stuff, and then kind of go really quickly into the safety stuff, and definitely want to leave time for a question and interaction, because just looking at the names and where people are, it's a great group, and would love to kind of figure out how we can incorporate them in the mix. So once the slides get up and running, one thing that John said that I want to poke at just off the bat, when he was talking about the fatalities, having been in this safety space for basically my entire career, the one thing I would say that John could also said is the type of transportation system that we actually deserve. The fact that we as a society, as human beings, accept the risk, it's like one of the most riskiest things we could do is actually get in a car and drive, is mind-boggling from that standpoint, just for the sake of getting from point A to point B, just for the sake of making the economy run. And it's not all isolated to, the human challenges that we have with alcohol and distraction, speeding, all the ills. There's better roadway design, there's better things we could do in the vehicle. There's, so it's more of a system look of the world. And, I'd like to position AVs as one of those pieces in that mix, because one of the, we'll call it myth number one, is people envision that AV deployment will be exactly the same as, you go to the dealership and you buy a car, or you go online and you buy a car that way these days. that's actually not the case. You know, we were talking right before the call around there are ways you have to scope this problem in order to continue to do it safely. And much like the title of my talk suggests, like it actually has to start with safety. Otherwise, there's no way you get to any meaningful deployment. So let's jump right into it. So if we go to the next slide, you know, it starts with our mission. And our mission kind of drives everything that we want to do. And so when you think about any company mission statement, you know, you can say anybody can put some words on the slide, but do people actually really believe it? And I can tell you that this challenge that we're trying to solve is really hard. And this mission is actually what keeps people engaged on it, you know, through difficult times that the industry is going through right now, but also just with respect to solving a really hard problem. And so it's important to note that safety is the first in here, not second. And it matters because it has to be safe. But then we want to do the work quickly because we recognize the challenge that is ahead of the country and the benefits that this technology can bring. And then we want to do it broadly. So that means we can't have a solution that works in a narrow domain, but then takes another 20 years to work in another one. So, you know, all of these words are deliberate and important in how we at Aurora think about building the technology that we're building. All right, so off to the next slide. So John mentioned that we are a full stack company. And so on this slide, you'll see the various platforms we are working on. And so, you know, you could kind of divvy it up into two big ones. It's heavy trucks and it's passenger vehicles. With the passenger vehicle application being what most people would call kind of the robo-taxi thing like we see in San Francisco. And the commercial trucks, exactly what it sounds like, long haul, over the road trucking. That is kind of what I would call the initial use applications. But to be super clear, we are not trying to be, you know, trucking companies. We're not trying to be shippers. We're not trying to do that. If we go to the next slide, what you'll see is what we're actually doing is building the technology that can make any one of those vehicles automated. And so that starts with some software. That starts with some hardware. So the hardware, think of things like, you know, the computer, the sensors, that kind of category of flavor. And then if you don't do the next part, which is the data services and platform, then you just have cool tech. We have to make this tech actually work for the customers. And so the way you do that is through services. So you can think of services of things like dispatch, where the vehicles are, what are they doing, when do they leave, you know, how do you tender the loads, all these kind of things that are very intricate in a kind of shipping logistics operation. We have to make all of those work for a vehicle that doesn't have a human in it. A lot of things today, you know, a human has to do a lot of things. So we need to replace all of those things in essence with services. So that's kind of the three big pieces that we work on. And I can tell you, even on the hardware side, you know, we just signed a deal with Conti. That is not our, you know, primary thing we want to be in for long term. And so we're working with a tier one who actually build all that hardware for us. And so then we will be mostly in the self-driving software side of the world and in the data services and platform side of the world. All right, next slide.
Hey, Nat, can I just jump in?
Yes,
Just for
please do. Please do.
On the Continental deal. Yeah, maybe just if it looks like you're getting to it right here, just a couple more words on that, please. What was the motivation there?
Sure. So on this slide, what you see is how we're building the ecosystem, again, to introduce this technology into the freight logistics market without much friction. So I mentioned we don't want to build trucks. So we have two great partnerships with Volvo and PACCAR, who have been building trucks for a very long time. Certain customers only use certain trucks. You know, it's kind of an interesting thing in the commercial space where, you know, you'll have a shipper, let's say, like we have on the right side, like a Werner or FedEx and a Uber Freight, who will only use certain types of vehicles. You know, their whole maintenance operations around kind of certain types of vehicles. And so being able to work with two of the world's leading truck manufacturers gives us the ability to kind of introduce this tech in a way that's essentially seamless for the customer. They go buy their truck like they normally would. And on the right, you see kind of the folks that we're working with. Again, many of these folks have been moving goods around the country for, decades, in some cases 100 years, that's not our business. So we were working with them to understand what are their pain points, and I'll get to a couple of their pain points in this presentation. Then again, there's another piece of it. John mentioned about the Conti piece. Well, right now we're doing a lot of, building hardware, building wiring harnesses, all this kind of thing, because we are still learning the business and building the tech. But long term, there needs to be thousands of these computers and tens of thousands of these computers, and then you have the replacement parts and all that kind of stuff. So working with Conti gives us the ability to have a very well-established tier one who has already done this for a number of years in the light vehicle space, be able to do this for us in the commercial vehicle space. And the way it works, kind of industry first, is, if we are out there doing good in the world, and making money on that, Conti also makes money on that. So it's a very good relationship that we have with them. And then, of course, trucks break down. And so, the relationship with riders to do those things that many of us take for granted today, oil changes, tires, all this kind of brakes, those things like that. Next slide. So I mentioned, we want to solve what are some of the industry pain points. And in this presentation, and the time we have, I can't get into some of the more business ones like driver shortages and things like that. I primarily wanted to focus on the safety piece of it. So one of the challenges in the industry right now is collisions. And think about it from this vantage point. These are professional truck drivers who have to go to school. They have to take a test. I can tell you some of the instructors that give these tests, they like to make you feel like you're 2 inches tall. They yell at you while you're driving this big semi, and they're really kind of rattling your nerves. They're watching every move you're making. Not many light vehicle people, I would say, could pass that kind of rigorous test. And so already this is an upper echelon of drivers. And even in that situation, you topple on now, they have federal requirements around drugs, around training, around alcohol, all these things. So then there's another thing, and then they have hours of service limitations, so they can only drive so long. And so you have all of these compounding things on these drivers. They're the best of the best, have all these federal regulations, and yet still have involved in a significantly number of crashes, on the order of 5,000 plus a year, fatals. And so there's an opportunity to kind of help chip away at that. And so this is one of the benefits we see of bringing autonomy to this space, is being able to improve the safety of those operations, not only from the standpoint of those vehicles themselves getting in crashes, but you'd be surprised to learn how many of those crashes are caused by light vehicles. And now with our sensors and sensor suite, we will actually have another benefit, which is to be able to provide the carriers almost real-time information around crashes that have happened to them in a way that they don't have access to today, which sometimes leads to very, astronomical lawsuits and settlements. So just another factoid here. All right, next slide. We can go on from this slide. All right, so one of the things that John and I were talking about is, kind of starting with the heart of this, which is the technology has to be safe in order to do all those great things that I talked about earlier. And so we start with what is arguably a very simple claim, but very difficult to break down. So our simple claim is that Aurora self-driving vehicles are acceptably safe to operate on public roads. Notice two key pieces about this statement. One, there's no comparison to anything that's happening today. So we're treating this like an engineering problem. We're saying the thing has to work and it has to be safe. It's much like if you think about building a jet engine, no one says, well, the jet engine needs to be as good as a bird. They say the jet engine, has some requirements, and this is the way I'm going to build the requirements around this jet engine. It's kind of that philosophy. So right there, you see that. I think the second thing you see in this statement, which always generates some discussion, is acceptably. And, obviously what comes to mind is acceptably safe to who? And so what I would say, if you go back, not literally go back, but if you think about the slides I showed earlier with that customer ecosystem. So think about it from this standpoint. We've got to prove to ourselves that it's safe. That's a high bar. Then we have to prove to the truck OEMs that we're working with that it's safe. It's another bar. Then we have to prove to the people that are using this in their day-to-day operation that it's safe. So that's kind of two levels of acceptable, if you would, before it even is out in the wild and doing its thing. And so the amount of rigor that we're going through with these conversations with our partners, with regulators, I even left them out of that hierarchy. We needed to come up with a way to explain what the heck we were doing and why we thought it was okay. And so this is where we kind of thought that the idea of a safety case is actually the right way to do this. Force people out of the comfort zone to look for a single metric, but understanding kind of the complete engineering work that we're doing, including our operations and including the enterprise. So we'll jump into it here. Next slide. So when you think about that statement, right, it brings all these questions into play. You know, a lot of times folks like to gravitate towards, well, can you handle a blown tire? And, you know, what happens when a rock hits the LiDAR and all this stuff? Those are all good questions, but there's thousands of those questions. And so we needed a way to organize our thoughts around all these questions. Then there's the normal stuff. Can it actually get from point A to point B? Can it chain lanes? Can it take an exit? You know, so again, there's another whole set of questions and things that need to be answered. You know, questions around what happens when you lose a sensor? Can the vehicle get to the right spot? What happens if somebody hacks into the vehicle? How can you know, so again, all of these questions, and we needed to organize them. So in the next slide, you'll see we organize these into these 5 broad, big buckets. And you can see now how that very broad statement starts to become an engineering problem. So we start with, you know, everything is going well, you know, proficient as we call that, you know, the vehicle can do its thing, nothing's wrong. You know, there's a bunch of claims in there that we have to answer just to solve that category of questions. Then there's sort of the fail-safe, you know, and this is generally what people recognize as, you know, all the redundancy aspects, you know, are you thinking through, you know, the LiDAR going out, like I mentioned, all these things. So there's a bunch of claims in there that we have to solve. Then there's continuous improvement, which in my opinion is maybe one of the more valuable pieces of the safety case, which is you basically assume that you messed up somewhere along the line. And then do you have the right hooks, so to speak, to be able to find those things out before they end up in an on-road event? So safety performance indicators is a term that comes into here, but you have safety performance indicators across the business, not just on the engineering side. You have it again on the operations, on the enterprise. So in our world, we think of things like, you know, are we getting enough safety concerns, and is that those safety concerns at a level that we expect them to be at? Then there's a bucket of resilient, and this is where we've put most of the claims related to kind of cybersecurity, things related to the product being misused either by us or a customer. And then the last bin is really around trustworthy. And this is, I think, one of the unique aspects, at least of our safety case, where we force ourselves to answer questions and claims around, are we being a good corporate citizen in all this? You know, are we working well with regulators? Are we talking to safety groups? You know, are we doing these things? And do we have evidence that we're doing these things? So again, you might argue that's a little bit more on the quote unquote soft side of the business, but I think recent news headlines would say it's a pretty important piece of making sure that you can put a product on the road in a safe way. Next slide.
Now, just before we go to the next, so in this slide, should we think about claims as kind of objectives that need to be accomplished from that engineering perspective, or requirements, if you will?
Exactly.
Should we think that the proficiency bucket is then clearly the most significant bucket?
Yeah, it has a lot of the claims around requirements, test coverage. Do you understand the operational design domain that you're putting this product in? You know, so on and so forth. So yes, for all intents and purposes, you can think of each of those numbers of claims are kind of individual problem statements that then the team is answering.
Excellent, thanks.
Yep. All right, so I mentioned evidence. So what does evidence look like, right? Evidence can look like a lot of things. Evidence can be a process doc. Uh, obviously the assumption, and not the assumption, I should say, the activity is you make sure that you're actually following the process. A piece of evidence can look like a set of requirements. Evidence can look like test results. Evidence can look like compliance documents that say kind of in the realm of, did we put a vehicle that was non-compliant on the road, and so on and so forth. So, you get to, hopefully that gives you a sense of, these aren't just a bunch of words on a page and then people just do some work. We actually have a rigorous process where we're actually linking all of those claims to these pieces of evidence so that it's kind of a easily be found. We can go to the next slide. Kind of think about it like the filing cabinet of what is the proof points that we have as a company that we've kind of done all these things. Next slide. So I thought I would walk through very quickly, because time is of the essence, on kind of one example of many, but I think V&V is probably the one most people are interested in, which is the verification and validation piece. And so I'm going to go through how we think about that. So if you think about all the things that you can encounter while driving, there are sort of things that you encounter all the time. Changing lanes is a good one. And then there's things you hopefully don't see ever. Someone crossing the median and getting into your lane right in front of you with no time to notice. And so we need to validate the system across all of those. And notice one thing I didn't use was this idea of edge cases, because I really don't, I think that sets up the mental model wrong, that you can somehow ignore those because they're, quote, on the edge. That's actually not true. You have to figure out how to solve for all of those things. And so in the next slide, you'll see how we kind of have thought about divvying up these three different scenarios, and then how we go about building scenarios against those. Next slide. All right, so if we think about the hardest part of that chart that I showed you, is that part on the end where these are kind of rare events. So the way we've thought about this is, let's go look at all the rare events that have ever happened in fatal collisions. And NHTSA has done this work already. There's a paper out there called the 37 crash scenarios. And so we took those crashes and then we amplified them. And we said, okay, we're not interested in understanding whether the Aurora driver can actually avoid all of these, because these are by definition, in some ways, crashes that you can't avoid. Car jumps in your lane at the last minute, physics are going to win. But what we're testing here is, does the Aurora driver do the right thing when presented with these scenarios? So is it applying max braking? Is it trying to swerve into a lane where nobody is? Is it, more importantly, does it swerve into a lane and there's an actor there, right? That would be not what we would want the Aurora driver to do. And so we have built this set around these rare scenarios. And in that way, even if we haven't seen something before, example that someone told me recently was, in a helicopter on the back of a flatbed truck. Well, come to find out, we've actually seen such a thing, but let's say we happen not to never see such a thing. Well, we would say, like, okay, that's a scenario that looks like some big object in front of us. We probably shouldn't go running into it. And so that's how we've thought about not just kind of the old way of thinking where you just drive around and hope you see everything and deploy, but rather capture your interesting events for sure, but then use this particular technique to ensure that even in things that you've never seen before, you can assure yourself that Aurora driver will do the right thing. Next slide. So I thought it would be interesting to also talk about, again, that the safety promise of this technology is awesome. And I don't know if it will play on here, but we can just go back and explain what this is. So this is a typical night scene that we encounter when we're running at night. And in this video, you would have seen, and I can provide it to John later and he can circulate to everybody, there was a pedestrian on the side of the road. And the sensing technology that we have can actually detect that pedestrian in this dark of night with no, illumination from the infrastructure from far, far, far away. And it's not until the truck is almost right on top of the pedestrian, can you actually see the pedestrian with your naked eye? And so when you think about what does this do for us? Well, it allows us to change lanes away from this pedestrian and give them space. It allows us not to get in a conflict situation with that pedestrian like a human might if they kind of came up in the night at 62 miles an hour and there was a pedestrian all of a sudden on the side of the road that they didn't notice. There are, unfortunately, fatalities on the highway with pedestrians and commercial vehicles and light passenger vehicles for that matter. So again, you can start to imagine how having just this ability to sense and see that far away in conditions that aren't necessarily great for us humans, that we can start to chip at some of these unfortunate conditions. I mean, these are just real scenarios that happen on daily driving out there. Next slide. So that's a little bit on the engineering side of things. I'm a big proponent of safety culture, and when John and I were talking, it was pretty evident that we should probably touch on this too in this talk. And so next slide. We've adopted what we call a safety management system. And if you've been following the Boeing news lately and some of the things that are coming out of FAA, they recently told manufacturers to adopt such a system. So this has been adopted in aviation, but for carriers, and it hadn't gone down to the manufacturing side. We've stood up this system now, for the past 3 years since the acquisition, and I can tell you it's very, very effective in trying to cover. Just if you're familiar with the Swiss cheese model, it gives you another layer of protection and mitigations for the organization. So, there's a safety policy component. So this is what it sounds like. Do employees know what the safety policies are in the company? How are they trained on them? All these kind of things. There is a safety assurance piece, which is, okay, things happen. We want to make sure we have, mitigation strategies to catch those things. So, they also kind of go look and say like, well, you say you have a policy, is it actually effective? So, you can see how those two things are pretty powerful. And then there's safety risk management, which is ensuring that the risk decisions are appropriately decided depending on their severity within the company. And then there's sort of the safety culture piece, which is, again, there's all sorts of nice quotes out there. Culture eats whatever for breakfast. It is true that I actually just saw a talk yesterday where someone was saying that safety culture will also kind of eat safety processes for breakfast if you're not careful, meaning that like if the culture is, yeah, we have a policy, but we don't follow it, well, then guess what? You basically don't have a policy that means anything. And so these 4 buckets of activity are things that are super powerful. And I think if you go back and look at some of the last big safety issues, you can see where a functioning SMS would have at least helped mitigate some of the things that happen in some of those cases. Next slide. So I don't need to read everybody all that, but if we just go back to that, you can see that the safety culture component is important for any company doing safety critical work, I would say. So even removing ourselves here from the AV space, if you look at our transportation system as a whole, I think there's a lot of benefits if we start thinking about, again, tech is a part of the solution, but tech can't be the only thing. We have to actually make sure we have a culture that safety is important out there for that tech to actually deliver. And it was amazing to me in putting together this slide with how many times it's in the news, just even for reporters to be hiding and pulling it out and putting it in the title of their stories is, it's not great to see because it means that we probably have some work to do there, but it also means that resonates with people and understand that you need to have a culture that embraces safety. Next slide. So one of the things we've done is reporting progress on how we're closing our safety case. So our safety case includes, like I said, all of those engineering artifacts. It includes things around risk management. It includes things around our safety management system. And we're the only company that's been reporting our progress on how we're doing on closing that safety case for driverless operations. So today we have a safety case that is closed for all of our operations with vehicle operators. We're now closing the next safety case for removing those vehicle operators from, the front and right seat. So that way we will have, the other pieces that we need to take care of closed, meaning all those claims have to be met. We have to understand what risk is out there, et cetera. So just yesterday, we updated this number in our business review. So this number is now 95%. So we're inching closer. One of the reasons we wanted to do it this way is we didn't want people to be surprised. If you look at every other deployment that's happened out there, people, you open up the paper one day and people deploy. So there should be no surprises for anybody. When we get to 100%, we will deploy. And so people have been able to walk on this journey with us, ask questions of us. We put our safety case and many of the claims, like the top four levels of our safety case, out in the public domain for free. Encourage other companies to use it, modify it however they see fit. Again, in the interest of kind of raising the tide in the industry. And so I think, from a safety standpoint, it is a more tractable way to understand all the things that we're thinking about so that we can figure out if there are any gaps for sure, but also to allow kind of just for a more concrete conversation around safety and not get lost in this comparison to all sorts of things that at the end of the day, that is not the bar for safety. The bar for safety is, did you do the engineering work? And I think that's it, John. We can, I think, kill the slide deck and have a conversation.
Super. So, Nat, the chat has been very active, lots of great comments. We're going to send you that file as well, so you can see the types of questions that people had, and Bhuvan will be queuing up those questions in 10 minutes or so. But let me just start with a couple quick reactions. There's a lot to talk about here. At risk, if you could try to constrain this to maybe a minute or two, and this is quite an impossible task, but you alluded to sort of, simulation of these various edge cases, right? So it's all about, a computer driving a car in regular situations is quite easy. A computer driving a car in challenging situations is not easy. It's just like people, right? So when we have these unusual situations, when we reflect on what happened at Cruise last October, where a pedestrian was struck by another driven vehicle, and pushed in front of an autonomous vehicle. It's such an unusual edge case to think about. What is your confidence in these simulation models to actually generate these unusual edge cases?
Yes, so and I can answer in less than a minute. So there's two parts there. So one is, do you have the right requirements? So, you can think about things like, what should your collision detection response be if it's a pedestrian versus a vehicle? And you sort of plan that out, and you kind of beat it up pretty good. You look at past precedent, like what has gotten people in trouble before. How does the agency think about this? The agency I'm talking about is NHTSA. So you can use a lot of that to help hone in on how you think that requirement should be written. And then your point is, then how do you test that? And so in our particular case, we test that both at the track, and then we also test it online. And online, we build lots of permutations around that. And we've also kind of done the work to ensure that, yes, the results that we're getting, online, so to speak, are matching what we would see in the real world. So, we can take a use case that we've had. We get sideswiped by another vehicle. We want the truck to do a maneuver. And so we test that like crazy in SEM. And in the real world instance we have, the truck does exactly what we programmed it to do, which is, come to a stop and, do the next part of the business. And so, I think it's less about the issue of Cruise in that particular case, and it's more broader than that. It's just like getting fundamental agreement and alignment on what is the correct response, because I'm sure there was a bunch of smart people who thought that was the right response. It turns out maybe not so much.
Yep. Okay. Well, look, let me zoom out a little bit
Sure.
into the broader topic of road safety. So I think it was when Mark Rosekind was the NHTSA administrator during your tenure as well, that this famous report was released that said something to the effect, or at least was interpreted to say something to the effect of 94% of all
Yes.
accidents are caused by human error. And, that report has been first put forth by the autonomous vehicle industry to say, look, we're trying to fix a real problem here. But then there have been critics who have said, well, wait a minute, isn't it also about the way that we design our road network as a
Yes.
system? So,
Yes.
traffic engineers are trained for level of service. How do you get more cars through a road? Well, we make it wider and we
Mhm.
make it straighter, and that encourages people to speed, and that causes more, fatalities. So you're on the board of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, right? Just a wonderful organization that's done so much to promote road safety. How do you think about balancing sort of these like big sort of social and system level challenges around the road safety world, and then introducing at the same time the potential of this new technology into that system?
Yeah, really, really great question. And this one deserves a little bit more than one minute.
Yes.
So yes, I think the 94%, um, the much maligned 94%, I should say, has been taken out of context in a bunch of different ways. I think if you go back to that NHTSA report, it was, it is a true statement that humans are a contributing factor in crashes. We sometimes make bad decisions, both in terms of just normal driving behavior. Oh, I thought that car was going to stop for me and it didn't. Unfortunately, more on the behavioral side. I mentioned speeding. Drunk driving is a big one. Belt use, all these things that we know what to do and we still do them anyway. Those are contributing factors in crashes. But the story can't stop there. There are other things we can do. Roadway design is super important. If you have a roadway design that encourages pedestrians to walk across a lane of highway that's going 50 miles an hour, well, that's probably not a great design. If you don't have any sidewalks for people to cross and they're only left to walk on the shoulder, well, that's another, problem. And so I think there is a way that we should look at the system. And the way I think about it is the technology we're working on will have benefits. There's no doubt in my mind it will have benefits. Uh, if we're able to get in fewer crashes than what we have today, by definition, we will have a safer system. But it doesn't mean it probably is not going to be zero, because there'll be other things that will happen that, happen on the roadway just in general. I look at, unfortunately, a lot of crash videos. And some of those, there is not an AV solution for that. There's other things we have to do, right? So let's pick on the drunk driving one, right? So there's active rulemaking right now to figure out, can we do alcohol detection systems in vehicles, require them in all vehicles, and then kind of, so both detect and then react. What the reaction should be, I think a lot of smart policy people over at NHTSA will try to figure that out. But if we're able to take, 10,000 fatalities off the ledger with that singular piece of technology, well, guess what that does? That makes actually easier for us to drive, because some of the weird cases we have to deal with are exactly that. Humans doing really, really bizarre things in front of the truck for, reasons I won't speculate. But if they're able to drive better, then it actually makes the burden on what we have to do a little bit easier. And so you can see how they work together, not in opposition to each other, or that there's only a one-way solution and it must be this. And I think that's what got missed in the narrative in the past decade, was this big number, this awesome technology, as opposed to this big number, we've got a lot of work to do on it. This is one tool in the toolbox, and we're pretty stupid if we don't actually try to use it to help address that. The other piece of it is it takes a long time for technology to penetrate the fleet. Various estimates out there, but I think right now we're probably inching closer and closer to vehicles being more than 13 or 14 years old on the road. So that's a whole lot of old vehicles with no new technology on there. And it's not like everybody's going to rush out and go buy new vehicles. And then the other stat is it
Yeah.
takes about 25 years for a single piece of technology to penetrate the fleet to, let's say, the 85 or 90% level. So we got a long way to go. We should not just be sitting back and waiting on one particular solution. We need to be actively figuring out what are all the different levers we can pull. Yeah, and Mark and I have talked a lot about, even since the NHTSA days, about the 95%. It is the right study. It is a true thing. It's just unfortunate that it was the only thing that people talked about and not the way that I think he and I were thinking about it, which is we got a lot of work to do, people. Like, let's get on with it.
Yep. Yeah, no, it certainly makes sense that it's we need a multi-pronged strategy here.
Yes.
Such a substantial challenge. One last question from me, and then I'm going to turn it over to Bhuvan, but it has to do with trucking. And so if we look at the safety statistics in the United States, so in 2022, fatalities that involved a medium or heavy truck, the figure came out to 5,936. So that's out of the almost 43,000 fatalities. So that's about roughly 12-13% of the road fatalities in the US somehow involve a large truck.
Yeah.
But those vehicles account for about 1 out of every 20 vehicles, 5%. So 5% of the vehicles account for 12-13% of the fatalities. Obviously, you have a higher risk factor.
Yeah.
Just briefly, sort of like, the case for autonomous trucking, was that the root problem you guys were trying to go for, to say, let's, from a safety perspective, these vehicles are in fact more dangerous, so we should really be focusing on them first?
I think it was yes, and there's a very strong business case for it. We didn't have time to get into all the driver shortage numbers and the big long lines we have at ports because we can't get our goods off the ship in time to get them on rail or truck. We've all, as consumers, have gotten very used to it used to be 3 days of shipping we were happy with. Now we want it in 1 hour, kind of thing. And all these things contribute to an increase of goods traffic on the roads in these commercial vehicles. And it is unfortunate because, again, these are the best of the best drivers. They have huge regulations on top of them, and yet we still have safety issues. I mean, I looked at a video yesterday of a truck driver who was so intoxicated that when he got pulled over, he actually fell out of the cab. Like, he was driving 80,000 pounds down the road. And so there's lots of, and I don't mean to malign the truck drivers. I think we've probably done a good enough job in this country maligning the poor truck driver, but these are 80,000 pound vehicles. And so if we can find a way to get this technology to be safe and on the roads, there's a huge opportunity for us. And it's not like those jobs then suddenly evaporate, because then there's other jobs I mentioned, so there's lots of things to do, local pickup and delivery, people can have a better quality of life, all these things that are really, really important that, again, we just overlook. But you are right. I mean, the thing about that crash stat that's also unfortunate is the fact that, generally speaking, the amount of safety technology available on commercial vehicles is actually lower, from the standpoint of either time or just basic availability than we have for light vehicles. And so these are some interesting compounding factors from a transportation perspective, deserve a little bit of a closer look.
Super. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Bhuvan for the chat questions.
Sure.
Thanks, John. Hi, Nat. So I'm going to try and combine some of the questions given the limited amount of time that's left. So there was a couple of questions around cost. A lot of debate on, is the investment worth the benefit of not having a driver? How much does a driver cost for a heavy vehicle? But I'm more interested in one question that was asked by Jane Chu, that is there a possibility in the future for a reduction in insurance costs for companies that adopt tech like Aurora's? If you see that cost reduction as a major selling point for your whole tech stack, and if the safety industry is doing anything, to lobby and integrate their safety data into common insurance formula. So just how that whole equation may work in the future. And how
I would like to think so. And I think some of the conversations we've been having with insurance carriers, I think they also see the promise that this technology can bring. There's also a reality problem. So I'm, they need to find some way to base the cost on. And, they have lots of smart people that have built all these models around, humans, not so much around technology. And so one interesting thing about using the safety case is they can understand, at least maybe not be able to quantify just yet, but kind of what are the things that we thought of in terms of putting this technology on the road and kind of trying to equate some risk with that. The second thing I think that is really, really appealing is the instant information around the circumstances around a crash. If you think about today, what happens? So a crash happens on our roadway, someone calls 911, the police officer shows up. So that's probably already 30 minutes have expired since the crash. All sorts of evidence has probably been disturbed by, Good Samaritans or whatever. And, the police officer is doing the best they can. They fill out a form. Oh, there's a cell phone on the floor. Maybe it was distracted driving. Maybe it wasn't, but they mark it down. And so there's all these things that, when you look at a crash report, you kind of have to look at it with, I don't want to say a grain of salt, but it's the information there has human issues in it. Versus in our situation, we will have near perfect replay of what actually happened. And so when you think about, again, the big lawsuits, you can see there might be a benefit to saying, well, hey, I can look at the Aurora driver rear camera footage and see that, client X, Y, and Z, you were speeding at this rate. You actually clipped the back of the vehicle. We can see what your trajectory was into the back of the vehicle, and then saw you glance off in a way that a police officer would have a very difficult time doing that today, and even the best crash reconstructionists.
Yeah, I think that's a great value add. Just adding, more granularity, and there are no maybes in the crash report that maybe the driver was distracted. You actually know what happened, right? So
right.
That's yeah. Moving on from the cost question, there's a question from David Whitehouse that people are not that great in understanding statistics and risk. A single case of a self-driving truck being involved in a fatal accident will make headlines. We saw that with Cruise, while so many accidents happen every day that are not making headlines. So how does Aurora think about addressing the emotional side of the issue? I mean, it's bound to happen, right? There's bound to happen. There's bound to be a crash, a fatality involving an AV truck. As much as we don't want it to happen, and that's going to make headlines everywhere. So how do you address the emotional aspect?
Yeah, this is a tough issue. And there's another piece of that question. I really love this question. We as human beings, when we give up control to somebody else, we place a high bar on them. So if you think about train crashes or motor coach bus crashes, the public's reaction to those, even if there's been one of those in the last 5 years, is so much greater than the 100 people that died, that day, right? And so there's this mismatch between not only our perception of what we see as risk, but also in terms of when someone else is doing something for us, we hold them to a higher standard. And so the heart of this question is there is no easy answer here. The best we can do as a company is be transparent about how we got there in the first place, which is what we're doing now. Be transparent with the regulators that have, responsibility in this area, kind of big R responsibility to make sure they're keeping the roadways safe. And then I think the third thing is being humble about when the bad thing happens, making sure that we're going to do everything in our power to learn from that incident and to make sure it doesn't happen again. And there are a couple ways you can do that, right? You bring in outside experts, you do that, all that kind of stuff, but then you make the results public and you say, this is what these people found. This is how we're fixing it. And then you kind of keep going, right? There isn't a magic formula. There isn't some magic engineering you can do to prevent the thing, because it will happen and the public's reaction will be correctly hey, what's going on here? This is pretty scary. We need to be able to respond being transparent and responsible.
I mean, it seems that, culture is a critical component of, ensuring safety practices. And there was a lot of appreciation in the chat when you presented those slides. But, the next question from Amelia is that given that these are often at odds with investor priorities or profit maximization, so what structures exist at Aurora to ensure that the safety culture remains institutionalized? And it's not just in name, but also in practice, and are there competing incentives that can be set up to ensure that it is prioritized, even when, when shit hits the ceiling, we need to deliver with some shareholder value and things like that,
Yeah, we've done it a couple of different ways. One is establishing my role, right? Having a chief safety officer that reports to the CEO, not just in title, but in actual practice. There are some best practices around what a chief safety officer should do and look like. We have those instilled here. Having effective programs, making sure those programs work. I think there's also an institutional thing around making sure that the entire executive team is also bought in. Having everybody feel the weight of their decision on safety is really, really valuable. And so that's one way to kind of make sure, at least institutionally, that safety isn't just a check the box exercise. So we do things like, surveys, and National Safety Month is coming up here in June, and we'll do a lot of things internally. You'll probably see me, say something externally at some point too, but those are all things that you have to do to kind of keep it going, because it's easy to go from a 0 to let's say a 99 on safety. It's really hard to stay at 99. And so it takes vigilance and it takes programs, and that's what we constantly work at. There isn't a mandate or something you can say. You actually have to have it worked and worked and worked and worked. And that's the only way you can stay on top of it. So really great question. And something that my team spends a lot of time on is really making sure that we are not becoming complacent on our safety programs and our safety approach.
Glad to hear that. Let me try and get this last one in.
Yeah.
So there are two key differences between, the ones in the news, such as Waymo and Cruise and Aurora. Y'all have started with freight versus passenger, transportation, and y'all are operating on, highways and not urban streets. So do you see advantages and disadvantages, in the two different spheres? And just quick thoughts on that before we close.
Yeah, definitely there are differences. I would say the one advantage is less chaotic. Driving surface streets is chaotic. We have to drive surface streets, but the surface streets that we're driving are much more industrial. They're not downtown urban. They're not shopping plazas. They're like literally by these giant terminal warehouses where there's lots of truck traffic going in and out, carrying goods all over the place. Whether that be in Dallas, Houston, or El Paso. I think the other thing is things like construction are a little bit more predictable, because generally speaking, the state doesn't like to rip up the highway for no good reason, and those projects go on for a long time. As of yet, there's not people running around in mass quantities on the highway. So there's unique things, but then there's also different things to worry about. So the speed matters here, right? So you might be able to stop a taxi in a 30-mile-an-hour zone and rationalize why that's safe. It's really difficult to do that for a truck tractor going 65 with everyone else around us going 85, 90, even 100 on Texas roads. So this makes the safety trade-off conversations different. And so, yeah, there are differences. And I don't really, yes, it's an advantage in some extent, but it's still difficult work.
All right.
Great.
I think we just passed time, so I'll pass it to Genoa.
Sure. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. It's such a great conversation. And Nat, thank you again. Particularly appreciate your point of being humble. No one can be perfect, but when bad things happen, be humble, take the opportunity to learn, and try to do really absorb into part of the knowledge base, not repeating the future, right? Also a point of not being complacent. You can reach that, but maintain this high rigor and high attitude. That's really wonderful. So everyone, please join me thank Nat Beuse for the conversation today.